If you've ever lit a match or turned on a gas burner, you probably didn't think twice about it. Fire is just there. It's always been there. But there was a time when it wasn't, when every member of our genus lived in a world without it, and the question of when exactly that changed is one of the most debated problems in all of human prehistory. The answer keeps getting pushed back. Every few years, someone pulls something out of the ground that forces researchers to reconsider what they thought they knew. And what they found suggests that fire didn't just change how ancient humans lived, it may have changed what we are. Let's start with what fire actually meant for a species trying to survive. You have to understand that for most of human prehistory, the night was dangerous in a way that's almost impossible to picture now. Predators don't sleep on a schedule that's convenient for you. Early humans were prey as much as they were hunters, and without any reliable way to defend a sleeping group or signal across distance or even stay warm in a cold season, survival depended heavily on luck and numbers. Fire changed all of that at once. A controlled flame at the entrance of a shelter keeps large animals away. It extends the usable hours of the day. It dries meat and makes it last longer. And cooking food, it turns out, does something to the human body that raw food simply can't. Here's the idea that makes this more than just a survival story. A biological anthropologist at Harvard named Richard Wrangham has spent decades arguing that cooking didn't just help early humans, it physically transformed them. His hypothesis, which he laid out in a book called Catching Fire, is that when our ancestors started regularly cooking food, they unlocked far more calories from the same amount of material. Cooked starch and protein are dramatically easier to digest than raw versions. Your gut doesn't have to work nearly as hard. And over thousands of generations, Wrangham argues, this allowed the digestive system to shrink and the brain to grow, because the energy that had been going into running a massive gut could be redirected. The brain is expensive. It burns roughly 20% of your body's total energy. You don't get a big brain for free, and cooking may have been how early humans paid for it. So when did this start? That's where it gets complicated. The oldest unambiguous evidence for fire use by any human ancestor comes from a site in South Africa called Wonderwork Cave. Researchers analyzing layers of sediment found burned bone and plant ash that dates to roughly 1 million years ago. The burning happened inside the cave, which matters, because it suggests this wasn't just a grass fire that swept through. Something was carrying and maintaining a flame. The species responsible was almost certainly Homo erectus, the same one that spread out of Africa and across much of the world long before our own species existed. 1 million years. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. But Wonderwork isn't even the most provocative claim on the table. Some researchers have pointed to evidence from a site in Kenya called Chesawanja, where burned clay fragments date to around 1.4 million years ago. Others point to discolored bones at sites in South Africa that some scientists interpret as evidence of fire from 1.5 million years back. The problem with these older claims is that it's genuinely hard to distinguish a fire that a human made from a fire that lightning started. Bones and sediments can burn naturally. Proving that a specific early human was the one who lit or controlled a flame requires more than just finding charred material. It requires context, and that's exactly what's so difficult to establish across such enormous spans of time. What's interesting is that controlling fire and making fire are actually two very different skills, and the gap between them may have been enormous. The earliest evidence suggests that ancient humans were capturing and maintaining natural fires long before anyone figured out how to create one from scratch. A lightning strike ignites a tree. Someone carries a burning branch back to a shelter and keeps it alive by feeding it. That's a remarkable thing to do, but it's different from picking up 2 rocks and knowing how to produce a spark on purpose. The oldest evidence for fire-making tools, things like fire-hardened wooden sticks designed for friction, comes from much later in the record, well under 1 million years ago, and possibly much more recently than that. The Neanderthals used fire. That much is well established. Sites across Europe and the Middle East show hearths that Neanderthal populations maintained, and there's chemical evidence that they were selecting specific types of manganese dioxide, a material that makes fire easier to start. This wasn't accidental. They understood what they were doing. One site in France called Pec de Leze has yielded blocks of that same manganese compound with signs of use, suggesting Neanderthals were actively seeking out and carrying materials specifically because of their fire-starting properties. These were not people stumbling around in the dark. They had a working knowledge of fire that took generations to develop and pass down. So what did fire actually do to the social life of early humans? This is where the evidence gets harder to measure, but arguably more interesting. Anthropologists who study modern hunter-gatherer communities have noted that fire extends the day. Once the sun goes down, a firelit camp becomes a space for conversation, for storytelling, for working through disputes and passing along information. Some researchers have argued that the campfire is essentially the birthplace of human language as we know it, not because fire caused language, but because it created the conditions where complex social communication paid off in ways it hadn't before. You have hours of shared attention every evening, and you can fill them with something other than silence. The cooking hypothesis also raises a question worth asking. If cooking made such a dramatic difference to human brain development, why didn't other species figure it out? Chimpanzees, our closest relatives, can understand fire. Studies have shown they won't panic at a controlled flame and can recognize that cooked food is more palatable than raw. They just don't take the next step. They don't gather fuel, they don't tend to flame, and they don't cook. The gap between understanding something and building a practice around it is apparently enormous, and crossing it may have required a combination of cognitive and social abilities that took millions of years to assemble. By the time Homo sapiens arrived on the scene roughly 300,000 years ago, fire use was almost certainly already ancient. Our species inherited this technology from a long line of predecessors who had been refining it for hundreds of thousands of years. What changed with Homo sapiens wasn't necessarily the use of fire itself, but the sheer variety of things we did with it. Evidence from sites across Africa, Europe, and Asia shows fire being used not just for warmth and cooking, but for hardening wooden tools, for processing ochre to make pigments, for clearing land, and eventually for firing pottery and working metals. The same basic tool that a Homo erectus population used to survive a cold night became the foundation of smelting, glasswork, and eventually the industrial furnace. There's a site in Israel called Kesem Cave that sits in an interesting position in this whole story. It dates to between 300,000 and 400,000 years ago, and it contains one of the best preserved hearts ever found from that period, a central ash deposit that researchers believe was used repeatedly over a very long span of time. The bones found around it show cut marks and burn patterns consistent with systematic butchery and cooking. Whoever lived there wasn't just using fire occasionally. They were building their daily life around a fixed central flame. That's a meaningful shift in how you think about shelter, food, and where you sleep at night. The question that's harder to resolve is whether all of this fire use was truly controlled in the sense we mean it today, meaning sustained, intentional, and transferable. A population that carries fire from an existing source is dependent on external conditions in a way that one capable of producing fire isn't. If your torch goes out and you don't know how to make a new one, you're back to the dark. The shift toward reliable fire production, toward knowing how to start a flame whenever you need one, is probably one of the most consequential practical skills in the entire human story. And the honest answer is that we don't know exactly when most populations made that transition, because organic fire-making tools rarely survive in the archaeological record. What we do know is that by around 400,000 years ago, fire use appears with enough regularity and enough consistency across different sites and different species that it was clearly no longer a novelty. It had become a default part of how certain human populations organized their existence. The hearth had become the center of the camp, and once that happened, the world started looking different, because now you could live in places that would have been impossible before. Northern Europe in winter, high-altitude zones, coastal environments where raw shellfish and cold water would have made survival marginal at best. Fire didn't just make life more comfortable, it dramatically expanded the map of where life was possible at all.